70,000 feet above the Ural Mountains, the sky is nearly black. The curvature of the Earth bends gently at the edges of the windshield. There is no sound up here but the whisper of thin air against the fuselage and the steady rhythm of one man's breathing inside a pressure suit. His name is Francis Gary Powers. He is 30 years old. He is alone. Somewhere beneath him, hidden among the birch forests and industrial smokestacks of the Soviet Union, men are tracking his every move. He does not know it yet, but in the next few minutes, a single flash of light beneath his wing will end his mission, nearly end his life, and shake the foundations of the Cold War. He carries a coin in his flight suit. Hidden inside it is a poison-tipped needle. He has been told, without ever being ordered, that some things are worse than death. This is the story of a spy plane, a pilot, and the single mission that almost brought two superpowers to the edge of war. In the spring of 1945, American and Soviet soldiers shook hands on the banks of the Elbe River. They had crushed a common enemy together, and for a brief, fragile moment, it seemed as though the world's two rising powers might build a peace to match the war they had just won. That moment did not last. Within 2 years, the alliance had curdled into suspicion. Winston Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain falling across the continent. Germany was split in two. Eastern Europe disappeared behind Soviet control. And in Washington, a new and unfamiliar kind of fear began to take hold. Not the fear of invasion, but the fear of not knowing. The United States had beaten Japan with the atomic bomb. But by 1949, the Soviet Union had won too. The nuclear monopoly America had counted on was gone, and with it, a certain kind of safety. Now the great question of the age was terrifyingly simple. What was the Soviet Union building and where? Nobody could say for certain. The Soviet Union was a closed country, sealed off from Western eyes, its military programs buried deep behind borders no American could legally cross. Washington feared a missile gap, a world in which Moscow might quietly outbuild American nuclear forces, while the United States remained blind. In an age when a single miscalculation could end in catastrophe, intelligence was no longer a luxury. It was survival itself. The Cold War would not be won on a traditional battlefield. It would be won in large part in the shadows through information. And the men who ran America's intelligence agencies knew they needed something that had never existed before: a way to see over the wall. In late 1954, in a nondescript hangar in Burbank, California, a small team of engineers received an assignment that sounded almost impossible. Design an aircraft that could fly higher than any interceptor, any missile, any radar system on Earth believed possible, and do it in months, not years. The man they turned to was Clarence Kelly Johnson, chief engineer of Lockheed's secretive Advanced Development Division, a unit so shrouded in secrecy that employees simply called it the Skunk Works. Johnson had already built some of the fastest and most advanced aircraft in American history. Now the Central Intelligence Agency was asking him for something different. Not speed, but altitude. An aircraft that could glide above 70,000 feet, so high that Soviet fighters and missiles of the era, in theory, could never reach it. What Johnson's team produced looked almost fragile. A single-engine aircraft with impossibly long, narrow wings, closer in spirit to a glider than a jet fighter. It was so lightly built that it could barely support its own landing gear. Engineers gave it bicycle-style wheels that dropped away after takeoff. It required a special low-volatility fuel, developed specifically so it would not boil away in the near vacuum of the stratosphere. It was, in every sense, an aircraft built at the edge of what physics would allow. They called it the U-2. Lockheed built the first one in under 9 months, and it took to the sky for the first time in August 1955, reportedly rising into the air by accident during a routine taxi test, so light that it simply refused to stay on the ground. By the following summer, U-2s were flying secret missions deep into Soviet airspace, their cameras capturing images so precise that analysts could distinguish individual aircraft on a runway from 13 miles up. For the first time, American intelligence had a genuine window into the world's most secretive nation. President Eisenhower authorized the program personally, and he insisted the flights remain under CIA control rather than the military's, a distinction that mattered more than it seemed. If a uniformed Air Force pilot were shot down over Soviet territory, it would be, in the language of international law, an act of war. A civilian CIA pilot, at least in theory, offered the president a thin margin of deniability. For nearly 4 years, that fragile arrangement held. The U-2 flew missions over the Soviet Union largely undetected and unchallenged, and the intelligence it gathered reshaped how Washington understood its rival. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most successful intelligence programs of the entire Cold War. But nothing built at 70,000 feet stays hidden forever. Francis Gary Powers was born in 1929 in the small coal town of Jenkins, Kentucky, the son of a shoe repairman who hoped his boy might one day become a doctor. Powers had other plans. He wanted to fly. He joined the United States Air Force, trained as a fighter pilot, and by the mid-1950s had built a quiet reputation as a capable, disciplined aviator, exactly the kind of pilot a very secret program was looking for. In January 1956, Powers was recruited by the CIA. To join the U-2 program, he had to formally resign his Air Force commission. On paper, at least, he was no longer a military officer but a civilian employee working under contract. It was a strange kind of sacrifice. A soldier stripped of his uniform in order to keep serving his country in secret. His training was demanding and isolating. U-2 pilots flew alone, sealed inside a pressurized suit not unlike an astronaut's, for missions that could stretch beyond 9 hours. At altitude, a pilot existed in a kind of extreme solitude, no wingman, no radio chatter, nothing but instruments, silence, and the curve of the earth below. They understood, without needing to be told twice, what capture would mean. Interrogation, possibly worse. Some pilots carried a modified silver dollar concealing a needle coated with a lethal dose of shellfish toxin. Not a mandatory suicide device, but a private, unspoken option, offered by the agency and left, deliberately, to each man's own conscience. By 1960, Powers had already flown numerous reconnaissance missions along and across Soviet borders. He understood the risks of his work better than almost anyone alive. And yet, on the last day of April 1960, he prepared for one more flight, a mission that would take him deeper into Soviet territory than any U-2 pilot had ever flown before. The mission was designated 4154. Its plan was audacious. Powers would take off before dawn from an airbase near Peshawar, Pakistan, and fly north over more than 1,000 miles of Soviet territory, deeper into the USSR than any previous overflight, before landing 9 hours later at Bodo, in northern Norway. Along the way, his cameras were tasked with photographing some of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets, missile test facilities, and above all, a suspected intercontinental ballistic missile complex near the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, along with a plutonium production plant at Chelyabinsk. If American intelligence could confirm what the Soviets were building at these sites, it could fundamentally reshape Washington's understanding of the nuclear balance of power. The aircraft carried the finest optical equipment of its era, a camera system capable of resolving extraordinary detail from more than 13 miles above the Earth. Everything about the mission had been rehearsed and refined. Powers had flown routes like this before. He knew his aircraft. He trusted the altitude that had, for 4 years, kept every U-2 pilot safely beyond the reach of Soviet defenses. It was May 1st, May Day, the most significant holiday on the Soviet calendar, a day the CIA believed Soviet air defenses might be less alert than usual, their attention turned toward parades in Red Square rather than radar screens. They were wrong. Soviet radar picked up Powers' aircraft almost as soon as it crossed the border, and the alert moved swiftly up the chain of command. Fighter jets scrambled from multiple airfields, straining to reach an altitude their aircraft were never designed to touch. One pilot was ordered to attempt an extraordinary and desperate measure, to ram the American aircraft deliberately, sacrificing his own plane and possibly his life, since Soviet fighters of the era could not reliably fire on a target that high. He never got close enough. But somewhere below Powers, a new and secret weapon was waiting, one the CIA did not fully understand the danger of. Just weeks earlier, American intelligence had received a warning. A newly deployed Soviet surface-to-air missile, the S-75 Dvina, was believed capable of reaching altitudes near 70,000 feet. The warning had not changed the mission. As Powers approached Sverdlovsk, Soviet ground crews at several missile battalions tracked his aircraft, waiting for it to move into range. The tension inside those command posts is easy to imagine and difficult to overstate. For nearly 4 years, Soviet radar operators had watched American aircraft cross their skies with impunity, unable to do anything but track and report. Now, for the first time, they believed they finally had a weapon that could reach that high. At 8:53 Moscow time, a salvo of missiles rose from the ground. Inside the cockpit, Powers had no warning beyond an instant. A flash, an orange light, and then the shock of an explosion somewhere behind and beneath him. The blast did not destroy the aircraft outright. It tore into the tail section, and in that same instant, the U-2's long, delicate wings, built for gliding, not for violence, began to fail. I looked up, I looked out, and just everything was orange, everywhere. Powers would later recall. The aircraft pitched forward and began to break apart around him, spinning as it fell. Powers struggled against the forces pinning him inside the cockpit, unable to reach either the ejection handle or the self-destruct switches meant to obliterate the aircraft's sensitive equipment. In the chaos of the tumbling wreckage, he made the decision that likely saved his life. Rather than eject in the conventional way, he manually released the canopy and pulled himself free of the disintegrating aircraft by hand, thousands of feet above the Ural foothills. His parachute opened. Below him, the wreckage of the world's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft scattered across the Russian countryside, and with it, whatever thin deniability Washington had been counting on. He landed in a field. Soviet farmers reached him within minutes. Francis Gary Powers, spy plane pilot for the Central Intelligence Agency, was now a prisoner of the Soviet Union. What happened in the minutes that followed reveals just how confused and dangerous that morning had become. Soviet ground control, uncertain whether the American aircraft had actually been destroyed, continued tracking debris falling from the sky and feared Powers' plane might still be flying. 2 Soviet MiG-19 fighters, already airborne and searching for the intruder, were ordered to continue their pursuit. Their identification transponders, historians believe, were not transmitting properly, or in the chaos were not recognized by the missile crews below. To one battalion commander watching his radar screen, the approaching MiGs looked exactly like a hostile aircraft. Another missile was fired. It struck the MiG-19 flown by 29-year-old Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov. He ejected from the stricken aircraft, but was fatally wounded and did not survive the fall. He was one of the Soviet Union's own, killed by his own country's air defenses in the confusion of a single desperate morning. A tragic and largely forgotten casualty of a Cold War confrontation that never should have escalated to violence at all. He was posthumously awarded the Order of the Red Banner. For years, official Soviet accounts of the day did not acknowledge that he had died. In Washington, word arrived that AU-2 was missing over Soviet territory. Assuming, as had happened before, that the aircraft and its pilot had likely been destroyed beyond recognition, American officials issued a carefully prepared cover story. A NASA weather research aircraft, they explained, had strayed off course somewhere near Turkey, its pilot possibly suffering from oxygen difficulties. It was a plausible lie. It was also, within days, completely dismantled. On May 5th, Nikita Khrushchev rose before the Supreme Soviet and announced, to the world, that an American spy plane had been shot down deep inside Soviet territory. He deliberately withheld one crucial detail, that the pilot had survived and was very much alive in Soviet custody. Washington, believing its cover story was still intact, repeated the weatherplane explanation. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The United States had been caught, unmistakably, in a lie, and the diplomatic damage was severe. President Eisenhower ultimately acknowledged what everyone now understood to be true. The U-2 flights had been ongoing for years, authorized, he said, out of a distasteful necessity. 2 weeks after the shoot-down, the leaders of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France gathered in Paris for a long-anticipated summit, a meeting many hoped might ease years of Cold War tension. It never had a chance. Khrushchev arrived demanding that Eisenhower personally apologize for the U-2 flights, halt them permanently, and punish those responsible. Eisenhower confirmed that overflights had already been suspended, but he refused to apologize. Khrushchev, in response, withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union and stormed out of the summit before substantive talks could even begin. The meeting that might have marked a turning point toward peaceful coexistence collapsed in less than a day. Historians still debate how much of Khrushchev's outrage was genuine and how much was calculated theater, useful for hardliners within his own government. What is certain is the outcome. An opportunity for dialogue between the two superpowers was lost, at a moment in history when dialogue mattered enormously. In August 1960, Francis Gary Powers stood trial in Moscow, charged with espionage. He was sentenced to 10 years of confinement, 3 in prison, the remainder in a labor camp. For the next 21 months, he lived inside Vladimir prison, enduring long stretches of solitary confinement and repeated interrogation by Soviet intelligence officers who pressed him for information he refused to give. Back home, his reception was far more complicated than a hero's welcome. Some Americans wondered, unfairly, why he had not destroyed his aircraft or used the poison needle rather than allow himself to be captured. He would spend years defending decisions that, in reality, matched exactly what he had been trained to do. Pilots were never ordered to take their own lives, only given the option. Then, on the morning of February 10, 1962, Powers was brought to the Glienicke Bridge, a quiet crossing linking East and West Berlin across the Havel River. On the opposite end stood Rudolf Abel, a senior KGB colonel who had spent years imprisoned in the United States after his own espionage network was exposed. At 8:52 that morning, both men crossed the white marker at the bridge's center, in one of the earliest and most storied prisoner exchanges of the Cold War, an event that would later inspire books and films and become known to history simply as the Bridge of Spies. Powers was home, but his ordeal, in some ways, was only beginning. Powers spent the following weeks testifying before Congress and enduring intense scrutiny from a nation still uncertain what to make of him. Had he compromised secrets? Had he failed in his duty? A CIA internal review ultimately concluded that he had done nothing wrong, that he had followed his training and his instructions to the letter, and had given the Soviets no meaningful intelligence they did not already possess. Still, official recognition came slowly, and for Powers personally, imperfectly. He worked for a time as a test pilot for Lockheed, and later flew helicopters as a traffic reporter for a Los Angeles television station. On August 1, 1977, his helicopter ran out of fuel and crashed while returning from an assignment. Francis Gary Powers was 47 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. It would take decades for the full weight of his conduct to be formally acknowledged. In 2012, 35 years after his death, the United States Air Force posthumously awarded Powers the Silver Star, the nation's third highest decoration for valor, recognizing the exceptional loyalty he displayed under nearly 2 years of hostile interrogation. His grandchildren accepted the medal on his behalf in a ceremony at the Pentagon that historians and military officials alike described as long overdue. The loss of Powers' aircraft did not end American aerial reconnaissance. It transformed it. Kelly Johnson and his team at the Skunk Works were already at work on a successor, an aircraft that would not simply fly high but fast enough to outrun any missile ever built. That aircraft became the SR-71 Blackbird, a machine so advanced it remains, to this day, one of the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever flown. At the same time, the United States accelerated an entirely different approach to watching its rival, one that removed the human pilot from danger altogether. Reconnaissance satellites, already in early development before Powers was shot down, took on new urgency after 1960. Within a few years, orbiting cameras were doing what the U-2 no longer safely could, gathering intelligence from a vantage point no missile could ever reach. In many ways, the story of Francis Gary Powers marks a hinge point in the history of the Cold War, the moment the age of daring high-altitude espionage gave way to the age of the satellite, the moment two superpowers were forced to confront, publicly, a war they had been fighting quietly for years. He was one man in one aircraft on one mission that lasted a matter of hours. But what happened to Francis Gary Powers on the 1st of May 1960 rippled outward across an entire decade. A failed summit, a collapsed diplomatic opening, a new era of intelligence gathering that would define how nations watched each other for the rest of the century. He never asked to become a symbol. He simply did the job his country asked of him, at an altitude where the sky turns black and a man is entirely alone with his choices. It took his country far too long to say so, but Francis Gary Powers did not fail that day. He survived it,